Fools! You think yourselves triumphant? You have only taken one step closer to the abyss. You have no idea what horrors lie ahead. You have seen nothing. The frozen heart of Naxxramas awaits you.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another boss guide for World of Warcraft. This week we'll be taking a look at the final raid boss of Naxxramas and Vanilla WoW, otherwise known as Kel'Thuzad. So without further ado, let's jump straight into phase 1 of this encounter. Phase 1 starts after your raid steps into the center of the room, and after a short monologue from Kel'Thuzad, your raid will then become surrounded on all sides. This phase will last for 5.5 minutes, and during this time, Kel'Thuzad will send waves of undead towards your raid with a mix of dangerous abilities of their own. These waves start off slow but slowly ramp up over time, and it's important that every side is being watched due to how threatening these adds can be if left unchecked. Coming up next, we'll explore these 3 unique enemies in greater detail that you'll be up against in phase 1. Soldiers of the Frozen Waste are fragile and slow skeletons that have very low health, but the biggest danger is their Dark Blast ability. This is a powerful spell that they use when they touch any player or pet, causing them to explode and deal high AoE shadow damage to your raid. So remember to assign a few ranged DPS players to take care of these during phase 1. They're incredibly weak, but it will only take a couple getting through to wipe your raid. Next up are the Abominations. These guys will be the focus of your melee DPS and tanks. However, keep in mind that they hit incredibly hard, and the healers will need to be on their A game. They also use Mortal Wound on your tanks, which reduces healing received per application, so tanks will need to rotate and let these stacks fall off before picking up a new Abomination. And finally, keep in mind that they are vulnerable to being disarmed, which should help reduce their damage. And then lastly, we have the Soul Weavers. These will be the primary target of your ranged DPS, and just like the soldiers, they're incredibly slow but very dangerous up close. Whale's Souls is a multi-target attack that she uses when she is at melee range for aggro targets. This is a high damage shadow spell that also knocks players away in front of her. Because she can change her aggro target very quickly, make sure to never be close to these at any point. Kel'Thuzad's first ability is his Frostbolt spell that he uses on his current targets that deals between 9,000 to 11,000 frost damage. This ability is cast at random intervals and must be interrupted by melee DPS, as just one getting through can lead to your main tank being killed. Every 15 seconds, Kel'Thuzad will cast Frostbolt Volley on every player in the room, dealing 2,700 to 3,500 frost damage. To deal with this, players are recommended to bring a heavy amount of frost protection potions and bandages. Finally, keep in mind that frost resistance can help with completely resisting this spell. Every minute, KT will cast Mind Control on the main tank and 4 other players, resulting in a complete aggro wipe. All DPS should stop roughly 5 seconds before this spell goes off, and off tanks should be ready to step in and replace the main tank once they're mind controlled. At the same time, mages and warlocks will need to use their CC abilities to control the other mind controlled players. Periodically during the fight, KT will target mana users and place mana detonation on them. This debuff causes the player to explode after 4 seconds, dealing AoE damage to anyone around them within 10 yards. The damage is based off the player's current maximum mana, and at the same time this ability will burn your existing mana pool in half. Throughout the encounter, KT will use Frost Blast on a random player that deals 130% of their max health as damage over 5 seconds. Healers will need to react quickly as this ability kills players very fast. But the most dangerous thing about Frost Blast is that it will chain the players there within 10 yards, meaning that players will have to stay spread out during the fight. And then lastly, we have Shadow Fissure. KT will occasionally summon a red circle under the feet of a random player that kills anyone standing in them after 3 seconds. These circles are very easy to avoid by just stepping out of them, so make sure to watch your feet during the fight. Phase 3 begins when KT's health reaches 40%. Guardians of Icecrown will then start appearing to join the fight. The Guardians feature a single ability called Blood Tap, which is a self buff that grants them increased damage and size per stack. There are 2 ways that allow them to get a new stack of Blood Tap. The first is every time they switch to a new target, and the second is any time a player dies for any reason during phase 3. 5 of these will eventually be summoned with a delay between each spawn. The first 3 will need to be shackled by your priest, but keep in mind that if more than 3 are shackled, then KT will break all the chains. The remaining 2 will need to be picked up by 1 or 2 of your off tanks and tanked in a safe spot or around the room in a circle. If your guild has issues with tanking them, then hunters can be used as a last resort to try to kite them around the room. Right guys, so we've gone through a lot of information so far, but we still need to tie this together with how your raid will be positioned during the encounter. For Phase 1, things are very simple, with your raid being in the middle of the room. Healers and melee DPS will stay around the center of the circle, while ranged DPS can hang out on the outer edges to take care of skeletons and soul weavers. And finally, tanks should always be in a good place to pick up abominations as they appear. In Phase 2, we changed things up a bit with KT being tanked in the center of the room, and the rest of the raid spreading out to different areas. It's a pretty big map, so let's go step by step on this. Starting with melee DPS, they'll be divided into 3 separate groups, A, B, and C, that will rotate interruptions on KT's Frostbolt spell that targets the main tank. At the same time, they're also spread out to limit the chaining effect from Frostblast. Moving on to tanks, it's recommended to have 4 geared tanks for progression. One will always be focused on KT, while the others sit by the throne ready to step in when KT uses his mind control ability. During Phase 3, you'll need 1 or 2 of these off tanks for the Guardians as we discussed earlier. And then finally, ranged DPS and healers will be spread out on both sides of the room and about 10 yards from each other to avoid chaining Frostblast. In Phase 3, everything remains the same except for the tanks. The Guardians will need to be tanked in a safe location, where they can be kited around the room in a circle by your tanks or hunters. As we head for the end of this video, I want to also talk to you guys briefly about using frost resistance for this fight. Because of the DPS requirements needed for Phase 3, your raid won't be wearing much, but I do recommend using your best 2 to 4 pieces for progression. Combined with consumables and buffs, this should help reduce overall raid damage, as most of it comes from the Frostbolt Volleys that can also be resisted. And also keep in mind, if you're using Flaccid Titans, it'll be harder to be healed if you're hit by Frostblast, so think about the pros and cons of using it. Right guys, so now that we've covered all angles of the fight, let's put this together with a basic recap from a player perspective. Phase 1 is incredibly simple and straightforward. The basic premise is not to let any of the skeletons or soul weavers get close to your raid, due to their dangerous abilities. Ranged DPS should always be focused on looking for their next targets, while tanks and melee DPS will take care of the abominations. And if everything goes correctly, then the melee should be the only players the healers will need to heal. The waves of undead will slowly start ramping up and becoming more intense, but the basic premise remains the same. Your raid will be doing this for roughly 5.5 minutes. So let's fast forward to Phase 2. KT will become active when Phase 2 begins, and he'll be tanked in the center of the circle. I also recommend popping a Juju Chill for the added frost resistance. You'll probably have some leftover ads, so make sure to take care of those and move to your assigned location as fast as possible. As Phase 2 abilities start appearing, such as Frostbolt Volley, every 15 seconds, the biggest advice I can give you is not to rely on your healer as a crutch. Always watch your health and use your frost potions and bandages as needed. Remember that before each mind control, DPS should stop 5 to 10 seconds before it goes off, and tanks should be moving in before, not after, the main tank is mind controlled. One of the off tanks will need to grab KT, start building threat, and whoever has the highest threat then becomes the new main tank, while the others go back to the throne. After this, abilities such as Shadow Fissure and Mana Detonation are very easy to avoid or handle with good situational awareness. And as we already discussed before, healers will need to be quick to spot any player hit by Frostblast, and keep in mind that melee groups are especially vulnerable, and abilities such as Chain Heal are incredible for these situations. But as we head into the last stretch of the fight, keep in mind that Phase 2 is essentially a matter of dealing with these abilities that feature a lot of RNG, while at the same time keeping track of your own character's safety. At roughly 40%, KT will then call for help and the Guardians will start spawning in. Your priest will need to come up with a plan when it comes to the shackles, but above all else, remember to only shackle 3 of them. 1 or 2 of your off tanks will then deal with the remaining Guardians. Whether they're tanked in a single spot or kited around the room is your choice, depending on your guild. So with having to deal with the Guardians on top of all of his regular abilities, things start becoming more intense, complicated, and your raid should aim for ending this fight as soon as possible. But given everything that you've learned and experienced up until this point in Classic, I have full confidence that with the right amount of dedication and perseverance that you'll be successful in the end. Aside from that, this is pretty much going to wrap up this week's boss guide. Kel'Thuzad is one of the hardest encounters in Classic, and hopefully this information has been helpful on bringing down the fight for you and your guild. Feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.